We all want to help those who are less fortunate than us. And I think that we could all lean in on that. But there is this failure to appreciate that in many ways, the way they're going about doing that is causing more harm than good. And of course, this FAST Act is the classic case of that.
Welcome to another edition of the Confidential Bulletin podcast. I'm Jot Condie, President and CEO of the California Restaurant Association. And today we have Christopher Thornberg, Dr. Christopher Thornberg. He's the founding partner of Beacon Economics, an independent research and consulting firm known for its accurateness in economic forecasting, which has established Beacon as one of the more reputable economic research firms in California. Dr. Thornberg, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Jot.
So today we're gonna talk about the FAST Act and what you've uncovered with the March 14 release of recent EDD employment data. But before we do, I kind of want to zoom out and give a broader backdrop. I've got a couple clips I want to play, and then we'll kind of talk about a little bit more background and get into it.
Too expensive to shoot here. There are no tax credits. So like all those other places are offering 40%.
Yeah.
40%.
Oh, yeah.
And then on top of that, there's other stuff that they do.
Yeah.
And then that's not even talking about the union stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's just tax economics of it all. So it's criminal what the California and LA have let happen. It's criminal. Everybody should be fired.
So that was Rob Lowe and Adam Scott. I think you and I were talking about this. I think you heard or watched that podcast, Chris.
I caught parts of it. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, they were they're friends and co-stars of the TV show Parks and Rec, and they were on Rob Lowe's podcast called Literally. And they were talking about the state of TV and film production business, which is a huge but shrinking economic force in California. And let me go to the last clip here.
California is projected to lose 3 seats, New York 2, also going to lose a seat, Minnesota, Oregon, Rhode Island, Illinois, all blue states. Who's getting these? Texas, Florida, Idaho, and Utah. I mean, this looks like game over. You know, and the reason why people are voting with their feet is a lot of what your book is about.
Yeah.
Taxes and regulation. I certainly been screaming about it forever. I did 3 years with a sign here that said, how long is it going to take me to get my solar hooked up? 3 years. Talking about it on television in this state. You couldn't do it. This state has almost 400,000 regulations. I just put in a new roof because the fire, I thought, oh, let's get a roof that's not going to burn up. 2 inspections. Why are you inspecting my roof? It's my fucking roof. If it falls on me, that's my problem. And we're taxed more than any other state. People are leaving these kind of states for places where they're not, they feel the heavy breath of government on them. It's not that hard for Democrats to understand this, but they seem to be incapable of doing anything about it.
Bill Maher, you can't miss those dulcet.
Yeah, that's Bill Maher on his show and Real Time with Bill Maher. So I don't know if there is a tipping point. There's always been critics outside of California, but just recently, across the political spectrum, obviously from those 2 clips, Californians are basically sort of suggesting that the California dream is more a California nightmare, and they're largely putting it at the doorstep of, our state and city leaders. And, here's the setup, and then we're going to get into that, but the FAST Act and the broader minimum wage discussion. For decades, trial lawyers, big labor unions, environmental interests have had an outside influence on how California is run, from the state capital to every major city, whether it's the plaintiffs' lawyer interest pushing laws that outsource enforcement to the private trial bar so they can line their pockets, or environmentalists pushing bans on natural gas, like in our kitchens, forcing everyone to pay higher utility bills, or labor unions pushing workplace laws that make it impossible for small businesses to operate, or medium or large businesses for that matter. And really, those three interests, let's call them the big three, have primed the political pump with hundreds of millions of dollars to elect people to push their agenda. They own the California policymaking apparatus. That's a fact. Campaign finance reporting data proves that. And, over the last 10 years or so, I would say, the news stories every day you read about or you hear about, yet again, another company that's left the state, or a lifelong, well-known Californian who's left the state for a better quality of life, or a small business shutting down because they can't survive under the burdens of, the state of California or a city. And really, it's sort of like the political ruling class, those who are elected by the big three's big bucks, who sort of respond to those stories and that narrative with, kind of a long yawn. Like, well, we're California. We're the greatest state in the union. We're going to be fine. And it just feels like we're starting to, I don't know, experience the cumulative impact over the last 20 years of, frankly, their collective unfettered agenda. And the results are, right, laws are passing. They're not thinking through a lot of these laws. They're not taking into account economic consequences or the sustainability of surviving, whether you're living here or operating a business here under those laws. So for every Rob Lowe or Bill Maher, there's, tens of millions of Californians who don't have a podcast and have that same sentiment, right? And I think what we're going to talk about here today, Chris, is kind of exhibit A, I would say, for what I've kind of explained, which is it's the state's public policy trajectory is run amok. And I think, like this FAST Act law is exhibit A. And, a long tortured history of the FAST Act law, but, it was a 3-year, 2.5-year fight. And ultimately, the governor signs the bill. It takes effect a year ago. And since April 1, so a year that this has been in effect, there's been warring narratives. There's been on, the supporters of this law. They trot out a report showing data saying there's negligible impacts on these small business owners who are running these businesses. And then certainly, from our side, there's also been studies that suggest there's major consequences. And those numbers are kind of disconnected from the reality, I know. And, I've seen it anecdotally every day talking to restaurant operators, who are feeling the burden, are struggling to stay in business, don't know if they can stay in business. They're running the numbers. It's tough. And yet, they're reading these stories from these studies by these labor-backed outfits that say, it's no big deal. There's been no impact.
Yeah.
So you've uncovered some numbers, or the EDD released some numbers, and you've reached a different conclusion.
Well,
Tell
look,
me about that.
yeah, there's a lot to unpack in everything you just said, Jot. And, look, the FAST Act is, if you will, the kind of the tip of the iceberg, as the case may be, because we all have to remember that the state has a $16.50 an hour minimum wage right now, which is one of the highest in the nation. And then they've chosen to create a special carve out for franchised limited service restaurants and bump it up to $20 an hour. And let's not forget that that's not fixed, but rather it's subject to the whims of this non-elected restaurant board that can unilaterally choose to raise it even more if they want to, right? And those folks are basically selected by the governor. So it's not even a democratic process. There's a lot, again, to unpack here about what I would call the broader problems with state policy and how they are, I wouldn't say imploding our economy. I think that's a strong word. And, look, economies don't operate that way. but rather what they're doing is they are creating a lot of expenses within our economy, which by definition cause the price of everything to go up. And by the way, those increases in prices are typically hurting the very people they want to help, which is lower income families. These are the ones who are most suffering from the higher cost of housing, from the higher cost of food, from the higher cost of transportation, from the higher cost of pretty much everything we face here in California. For me, the frustration is that while certainly the motivations of our state leaders are right? We all want to help those who are less fortunate than us. And I think that we could all lean in on that. But there is this failure to appreciate that in many ways, the way they're going about doing that is causing more harm than good. And of course, this FAST Act is the classic case of that. Now, let's back up for a second, because as you pointed out, last April 1st, 2024, we had this special minimum wage put into place for corporate-owned franchise restaurants, more or less slightly over half of all limited service restaurants in the state from our calculations. That's an enormous increase, particularly in lower priced places. You probably didn't see it much in San Jose and San Francisco, where they're already paying over $20 an hour just because it's an expensive place and labor costs are already high. But when you think about places like East LA or Riverside or Fresno or even Sacramento, you know that this was a substantial increase in labor costs. And in many ways, this is a very much what economists would call a natural experiment, right? Which is to say that they've passed the law, it's fairly draconian, it's occurring in one part of the economy. Ergo, boy, if you're going to have an impact, this is where you're going to see it. So I think a lot of folks have been waiting to see how things shake out. Some are waiting more than others, right? And to your point, a number of groups, including, of course, one of the labor institutes at Berkeley, and there's a group out of the Harvard Kennedy School, have already put forward reports claiming that this thing is nothing but sunshine and light. There's no evidence of any side effects. What a wonderful law we have. And don't get me wrong, there have been some other groups that have also been pushing back and saying, no, no, you can see some increases in prices and, the labor numbers don't look all that good. But all of this is too early. It's way too early.
For the
If you
but for the numbers, right? Because every single operator I talk to, from the
right,
moment this law took effect, they are struggling mightily, right? So I guess just waiting for the numbers to tell a story, right? You have to wait a year or so.
yeah, you
Immediately,
do.
these
Yeah,
operators were trying to figure out, how am I going to stay in business? And I'm seeing it. So you see these reports where they're throwing out these numbers that don't match reality, and it's frustrating as hell.
yeah. Well, let's go through that real quick. First of all, let's also be clear that it's not as if fast food is closed down in the restaurant. You look at the taxable sales numbers, and they're still selling stuff. People are still going to McDonald's, so it's not as if this part of the economy has closed down. But yeah, not only have we heard the complaints of the restaurant managers and owners, but a lot of people are out there on Instagram and Facebook complaining about how, they went to McDonald's and they can't believe the price of a meal nowadays. So yeah, the word on the street is that you're seeing this. Now, as noted, there are a group of people out there, a lot of people who were clearly strong advocates for higher minimum wages from the get-go. A lot of people who are behind the FAST Act have been claiming this a big success. Now, what we're talking about here is what I would call the academic debate versus the word on the street debate, right? The word on the street debate is pretty much out there, but the word on the street debate is not what tends to filter into the minds of policymakers in Sacramento. They want to see some actual high level macro data. And as I was saying, the problem here is really twofold. A, look, the impacts of minimum wage don't happen overnight, right? It's not as if somehow or other when we went from March 20th to April 10th that the world changed and everybody immediately readapted and prices went to where they were going to go and labor is going to go. Look, every employer always operates at a bit of a fog bank. We're always being buffeted and hit by changes in cost and demand and everything else. And thus, you have to feel your way forward. So it's coming up. You're going to have this big increase in labor costs. You start adapting, you start raising your prices, but you got to feel your way through it. And by the way, there's a whole other part of it, which is that when you have a big increase in costs, there's going to be some shakeout. Some companies just aren't going to make it and they're going to shut down completely. And again, that doesn't happen overnight. It could take 3 months, 6 months. So, what this is all saying is that anybody who came out a few months after this and said, hey, it's a success, the answer is no, no, no. You are seriously jumping the gun. You have to wait a long time to start seeing this thing shake out, to see it in what I would call those market aggregates. And then there's a whole other issue, and this goes back to the March release. We have to remember that when the government collects data, that data is based on samples, and those samples have to be weighted to some population estimate. And what that means is as more information comes in, weights often change and the estimates change. And when it comes to employment, at the end of every single year, there's a big revision in our employment numbers. It's called the re-benchmarking. And I won't get into the technical details. Basically, it boils down to the fact that we have a small survey called the CES, which is weighted up to a population level through the QCW, lots of acronyms there. I won't bore you with the details. The key here is those QCW numbers are 6 to 9 months behind the CES numbers. And so they run the best they can over the course of the year, but at the end of the year, when they have a whole other year QCW data, they rebuild the weights and then redo the estimates. So in March, we got the new numbers for 2024 as opposed to the old numbers. And guess what? There was a big revision, not quite the same as I anticipated. I've noticed a big gap in California data because we were having a lot more payroll jobs than we were household workers, which is always a sign there's going to be some revisions. Now there were. Turns out the payroll numbers weren't revised down nearly as much as I anticipated, less than 0.5%. And by the way, our labor force was significantly increased, which is great news for California because we're so labor force short. But with that said, when you dug into the data and you said, okay, but were the down revisions, the same? And the answer is no. In fact, a couple sectors had bigger revisions. One of the biggest revisions was actually in restaurants. Both full service and limited service restaurants saw a substantial decline. And what that does is it changes the story about what happened over the course of last year in response to this new minimum wage. The original data had said almost no change in employment. Now, by the way, that's not good because in the rest of the nation, employment's up about 1% in the limited service restaurant. So being flat, well, you could say it's not as good as the nation, but as you already pointed out, California's not doing as good as the nation. So maybe that could be anticipated. But the revisions changed it completely. We saw the number of jobs in the limited service restaurant industry revised down by over 21,000 jobs. And what that means is from January of 2024 to January of 2025, our new estimates now say that the job losses in the limited service restaurant are about 3%, 3.2% over the course of the last year, compared to plus 1% for the rest of the nation. Now you're talking about an enormous difference between the nation and the state. There's
And that's
another.
just limited service restaurants,
This is
right?
just limited service. Now, full service was also pushed down, but not by as much, which is interesting because if it's a coolback in demand, limited service restaurants actually have kind of a fortunate position. Let's say there's a cooling off of overall demand for restaurants. Well, what happens is some people drop out of limited service and go to the supermarket, but then some people drop out of full service restaurants and go to limited service.
They trade
So
down.
when you see a decline in demand, it will typically hit full service restaurants more than limited service. So even there, the fact that limited service had a much larger downward revision suggests that, yeah, this is a minimum wage effect. And then it even goes to the point that when you see these kind of revisions, it typically happens because of an unexpected change in trend, which is exactly what you would expect if there was a 25% increase in the minimum wage for these restaurants. And let me say something else about this number. And again, I don't want to hopefully I'm not getting too technical on this, but it's worth noting that only half the limited service restaurants in the state are actually subject to this, right? There's a whole bunch of those independently owned ones that are not subject to it, who are, of course, not having to deal with this. So the fact
So
that we're seeing this big of a decline when only half the restaurants are subject to this rule, well, that suggests something is going on out there. And yeah, there are jobs being lost in the industry.
So that number actually could be much worse because the ones that don't have to comply with the law are kind of masking, the
Exactly.
severe job
Yeah.
loss.
And
So
and
let me just ask you a
yeah.
question about go back to these other studies. And because these are studies that are being conducted by, well, Harvard and UC Berkeley, right? Do they know that they're putting out these studies claiming, happy talk, blue skies? Do they know that these numbers are not the right numbers? Do they know they should wait also till March 14?
Judd, I have to be really cautious about pretending I understand the motivations of other researchers. I have to be
Fair enough.
cautious about claiming that they're saying something they don't believe. So I want to tread really cautiously here.
It's
But
just
with that,
weird to me that
it
that
is
they're
well, it's way too early. And anybody who understands this data, anybody who understands how economies work, no, you have to wait for the data to come in to be able to test this stuff and to do it so early. Jumping the gun, yeah, I obviously it's suspicious to say the least. And
I
look,
have visions of
yeah,
these
and
academics standing on the deck of an aircraft carrier with a big banner that says "Mission
mission
Accomplished"
accomplished.
behind them.
Yes, indeed. And look, the Labor Center at Berkeley, I think it's called like I always call it the Berkeley Labor Center, but that's not technically their name. It's the Institute of something, something, something. Look, they are on record saying out loud that they believe that the bulk of economists agree minimum wages don't have an impact on labor market outcomes. And I got to tell you that I will respectfully disagree with that. That there's an enormous literature of many labor economists who would say that that's simply not true. Now, it is absolutely the case that minimum wages are harder to see in the data than what your typical supply and demand model would have you anticipate. You remember the old economics professor, and he'd draw the line, he'd raise the raised floor, and he'd go, look at all these people who aren't going to get a job. And you don't see that clearly out there. Well, when you're doing this kind of stuff in the real world, you have to account for all sorts of other things, right? First of all, employers have multiple mechanisms to deal with higher wage costs. They can raise their prices a bit. They can reduce hours and make people work harder. They can buy more capital, which will be one of the reasons they can have fewer people. So, in other words, the impacts come across multiple fronts. And we're just talking about one, the number of people working in these restaurants. My guess is even for the people who are left, they've seen a reduction in hours. Now, I know they claim that hasn't happened, but I
Oh,
can tell you
they
firsthand,
that
they don't
has
have data on that. That
yeah,
data
they
doesn't
don't have data on
exist.
that, and
Yeah.
100% of impacted small business owners who are having to comply with this law, 100% of them will tell you that they've had to downsize, they've had to cut back hours, they've had to increase prices. Laying people off is the last thing they want to do. But they all have downsized, which is why these numbers don't rattle or alarm me because I sort of every day talking to these business owners, I'm hearing it. So you're saying that the studies you've done a lot of research that we've consumed and used to try to understand the impact of wage increases. You're saying that even your typical minimum wage that happens every few years, although in California, the minimum wage has gone up every year for a decade.
Yep.
But,
Doubled.
before that, that 10-year run, it would go up a couple dollars every 5 years. And you're saying it's really hard to see impacts in those numbers,
Yeah,
right?
I did that report for the California Restaurant Association prior to the pandemic, where we sat down, and I think the minimum wage at that point in time was maybe $14 an hour, $15 an hour. I can't even remember what it was back then. But we did an analysis for you, and what we showed was, yeah, there were about 40,000 jobs lost in the restaurant industry as a result of the minimum wage going up from like $9 an hour to $14 an hour. Now, you didn't see that. I'm not saying that the number of jobs went down by that. But again, you got to remember the California economy was growing. So you had more demand, you had more people, and all of that causes an increase in the demand for limited service restaurants, which can offset some of the labor losses from the higher minimum wage. Ours was a but for analysis. It says that but for the higher minimum wage, there would have been 40,000 more jobs in restaurants. Or to put it a little different, we had 30,000 new jobs. We should have saw $70,000, 70,000 new jobs, something along those lines. Now, again, that's a subtle point. It's more subtle, I think, than your typical newspaper headline likes. There's an old expression, if you have to explain, you've already lost. But unfortunately, when it comes to economic conversations, sometimes you have to explain. Sometimes the details are important, and this is one of those cases. Look, some other work I've done on this shows that higher minimum wages cause an increase in youth unemployment. That's absolutely the case. We did some work just last year that I believe that you sponsored that showed that the higher minimum wage is responsible for the increases in cost of living that we're seeing in places like Fresno and Bakersfield and Riverside in the center part of the states. Because again, look, the minimum wage is not having that big of an impact in San Francisco and San Jose, where I think a lot of the legislators would think this is a great idea to live, by the way. Yet we know that the minimum wage's impact is a function of what I would call the natural set of wages already in extent in that market. The Bay Area is already really, really expensive. We know that. Thus, these kind of minimum wages aren't going to have that much of an impact. You're not going to see it that much in the ground level. But if you get out, again, to Fresno, Bakersfield, places where the people live, that that the politicians in Sacramento claim they really worry about. We all worry about the Central Valley. We worry about the low-income families. Yet, this is exactly where you're having some of the biggest impacts on the cost of living, and you're hurting the families you're claiming to help. And this is where I become so frustrated, when it's almost as if the virtue signaling is more important than the outcomes. Look, I want to help low income families. I want to help low income workers. This isn't the way to do it.
Yeah. Well, I think your point about those, with those who still have a job in that particular sector of the restaurant business, their hours are reduced. Their workloads are probably more intense. The ones that lost their jobs, and like I said, I haven't talked to one yet who hasn't downsized. You know that the ones that lost their jobs were the ones that probably need that job the most because they're, less skilled, less work experience, perhaps less than a high school education. The restaurant industry is one of those industries that we're proud of, provides people that first job experience. Those jobs are dwindling, and really a second chance. Those that perhaps have been incarcerated that need a second shot.
Yeah.
At getting back on their feet. These business owners are less likely to
Chuck,
gamble
can we
on.
talk about kids for a second?
Talk about
Because,
kids. Yeah.
yeah, because that's the study we did a couple of years ago through Beacon, where we showed that the increase in the unemployment rate in the state of California is almost exclusively driven by 16 to 19-year-olds. Guess where almost half of 16 to 19-year-olds work? Restaurants. Now, again, go back to that conversation about trying to run a McDonald's. You now have to pay somebody $20 an hour or more. Are you going to give a 16-year-old that opportunity? No. I got to pay $20 an hour, and 16-year-olds, you know, are not exactly, shall we say, the most reliable folks in the world. That's one of the reasons they need this work experience, to learn how to work. Look, I mean, if we all don't get fired once in our lives, how are we ever going to figure it out, right?
Right. Right.
So it's important. In fact, there's been numerous studies done that show that work experience when you're a teenager is incredibly important to lifelong success. And that's particularly true for our at-risk youth in a lot of these minority neighborhoods. These are the kids who are not getting jobs. These are the kids who are needing it. Look, the kid who is 17 years old and his father is a professor at Harvard, at Stanford. He's fine if he doesn't get a job. It's irrelevant to him. He's probably going to get an internship at his mother's law firm anyway, right? But that said, this kid in Fresno needs this opportunity. And I just don't see the trade-off here. doesn't make sense to me. And again, the stories, we know the politics of this. Whenever someone gets up and talks about how great this is, they always want to talk about the Latina with 2 kids, right? And how she needs a lift in life, which I agree with. But the best lift we can give her is not to give her a couple more bucks an hour, but to give her the training, to give her the ability to become a manager of a branch and maybe the owner someday. That's a different conversation than I'm going to lob you a couple bucks an hour and think your life's going to be great. It's not. You're not solving the problem. You're creating more.
Well, the proponents of the FAST Act are back at it again. I mean, not only in this fast food council, but now they're trying to push the city of Los Angeles to create their own version of this law. And
The
there's
city of
just sort of
LA
a
has
level
got,
of tone deafness that it's hard to grasp.
yeah, the city
Um,
of LA has $1 billion
Especially,
deficit they need to deal with, not labor boards.
it's
Yeah.
mind blowing that
Yeah.
that they would even consider this, and not only that, they were talking about expanding the scope of this local fast food council. Just ridiculous. Back to the videos that we played at the beginning of this episode. People are like, "Are you kidding me? You are clueless." The study that you did, or the numbers that you crunched to figure out what are the impacts, the true impacts of this FAST Act. I mean, I remember the study you did for us back about sort of the minimum wage going up over a period of time for the entire state of California. Is this alarming to you to see in such a short period of time that over 20,000 jobs in a particular sector of an industry, and not all of the limited service restaurants, that many jobs were lost?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, it's about 3%. And I want to be clear, we're not done because this is still working its way through the system. It's not finished up. When I did my analysis on this, these things take a year, year and a half to fully work their way through the system. I anticipate that as more data comes in, we're going to find more evidence. We're going to see more job losses. We're going to start seeing the closure of some establishments, which is going, of course, to reduce choice, particularly in lower end neighborhoods. I also anticipate more on the hours front. I think you're going to see very little increase in what I would call the net earnings for people in these limited service restaurants, because for some people who might get a little bit more money, other people are going to lose hours. And ultimately, I think that you're going to find that they aren't really moving the needle. But what worries me the most on this is a couple things. First of all, the fact that we're also focused on the FAST Act means we're ignoring the bigger picture, which is the $16.50 an hour minimum wage that everybody has to pay. And by the way, that's not just bad for the restaurant industry. Nonprofits are struggling with that. Care homes, whether like for elderly people or rehab, folks in rehab, they're struggling with this. Supermarkets, retail are struggling with this. There are all sorts of industries that are really struggling with this high minimum wage that it's almost as if we can forget about them now because we can all focus on the FAST Act, and that's not good.
It's still one of the highest. I mean, it's at 1650. It's one of the highest minimum wages in
Absolutely.
the
I
nation.
think Washington State and DC, Washington, DC are the only places that are higher. But what's even more concerning for me is the trend towards what I would call the balkanization of our regulatory structures. This is where things get really bad, right? Where you don't have one set of laws that applies to everybody equally. Instead, you have series of rules and regulations and collective bargaining agreements that are just separated in tiny little cones, which means there's no public debate over any of them. And you end up with a calcified labor market that reminds me of, well, Europe. And we know Europe's labor markets are not the best in the world. And wages in Europe are significantly lower than they are in the United States, in part because their labor market regulations are so intense. People don't appreciate that maybe in the context of labor markets, but let me explain it to anybody in California who's ever tried to get anything done on their house, like Bill Maher. You talk about balkanization. There's 12 different agencies in the city of LA that have some right of refusal over your ability to do something to your house, which is an astronomical number of desks you got to go through. And you wonder why it takes 6 years to get anything done.
Well,
Yeah, but talk about going the wrong direction.
yeah, and I can tell you, I mean, the restaurant industry is regulated by more government agencies.
But yeah,
I think the most regulated, federal, state, local, and now add another, the Fast Food Council. It's nuts. Chris, I know we're running out of time. Are we going to see somewhere a piece of you explaining kind of this new data and what it really means? I mean,
right.
the Atlantic, who's been in the news over the last 24 hours,
Yeah,
famously did that article last year, December of last year, entitled "The Job Killer That Wasn't."
yeah.
Prematurely, obviously. I mean, let's hope that you can put something together that we can all read, and we'll ship a copy to the Atlantic.
I think that'd be great. Yes, I have a piece coming out on this. It's already written. We're just trying to figure out where to release it. I call my pieces no nonsense economics, and we'll be releasing it on our website or be releasing it jointly with one of my partners. But that's still happening. With that said, it's easy enough to go find out about it. Where I know that one of the groups I work with, KFOB, have already done a press release on this and announced the downward revisions. It'll be interesting to see if there's any acknowledgement of this from the labor centers.
Yeah, I think them and every, mostly print publications,
Right.
a lot of the political publications that cover the public policy arena and the political scene, who've written articles saying nothing to see here, folks. This is not having an impact at all.
Yeah.
Need to revise their articles, just like everybody else should be revising their numbers so they're current
Yeah.
and.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. And those who have been supporting the FAST Act are claiming it's a free lunch, that somehow or magically the increased wages are coming straight out of the CEO of McDonald's pocket. Unfortunately, that's not how the world works.
And a total misunderstanding of how, who franchisees are.
Exactly.
They're independent, small business owners who, in many cases, put their life savings into buying a franchise and are supporting their family on it. And for whatever reason, just complete ignorance on how the economy works and how, the structure of a franchise system works, they think that these people are sitting in a corner office in Chicago or some big city, being fat cats, and they're not. Well, Dr. Chris Thornberg of Beacon Economics, always interesting to have a conversation with you. Appreciate you joining us on the Confidential Bulletin.
Great to be here, Chad, as always.